When I closed my laptop that night, the plan felt stranger than anything I'd ever imagined. I was a quiet, law-abiding woman, not someone who concocted schemes. But grief does strange things to a person. It doesn't only hollow you out, it sharpens you, makes you practical in ways you never wanted to be. I'd spent months gathering scattered evidence, screenshots saved in a folder, CDs of text message backups, photographs tucked away in drawers, emails printed and left in my inbox like quiet accusations. I had always kept things organized. Bills, warranties, receipts. When your life gets messy, order is the only real defense. Now that order became leverage. The first thing I did was make sure nothing could be traced back to me. I didn't have to be dramatic. No fake accounts, no threats, nothing illegal. I am not that kind of person, and I didn't want to be. What I needed was clarity that could pierce through the fog of sympathy the in-laws had built around themselves. If their story was a house of cards, all I had to do was place a clear, unadorned photograph of the truth right on the table and watch it fall. I started with the easiest thing, the photos. There were dozens of them. Cozy selfies of my husband and the other woman, snapshots of her at our kitchen counter, a picture of his hand on her waist taken in our living room. They weren't blurry, they weren't ambiguous. The mistress had lighter skin than me, hair the wrong color, features that didn't line up with anything I'd ever known. I remembered taking some of those photos without thinking. Once I realized, I saved them. I cropped, adjusted, and printed them on the thickest paper the print shop offered. The paper held the colors like a scream. Their faces looked obscene and domestic all at once. Next came the text. My husband had been sloppy. That's part of what made it unbearable. The mess of it. The casualness of betrayal. There were messages about dates, about money, about the children she'd had. There were messages to his parents, too. Little confessions. I love her. She's carrying my sons. We don't want you to know. I organized everything chronologically and printed it in black and white because the starkness of typed lines felt more judicial than the color photos. I put the most poisonous quotes at the front, things that would make a devout congregation recoil. I wasn't trying to shame the dead so much as to remove the comfortable veil of martyrdom. The in-laws had draped over their grief. The hardest part was the emails from the in-laws themselves, especially the one where the mother wrote to her daughter-in-law, me, demanding I do the right thing and emotionally blackmail the girls into accepting the boys as siblings. There was a message in that chain where they called my daughters bastards in a way that was meant to educate them about humility. That one I printed twice and folded into a little packet with a yellow sticky note that read,
read this. Tell me if you think they're the victims. Putting the binders together took an afternoon and a penitent hour. I designed the covers to mimic the church's hymnals. Small crosses, the same font, even the little divider ribbon looped through the spine. I thought about stealth as I worked. The binders had to look innocuous. I thought about dignity, too. I wanted the truth presented without venom, but also without apology. This wasn't a smear. It was a record. It was evidence for people who had been misled into feeling a righteous anger that wasn't theirs to feel. Sunday was humid, the sky split with long clouds that promised rain later. I drove to the church with the binders under my coat, my hands steady but my stomach tight. There is a perversity to walking into a place where people have decided your moral value for you. People smiled like they always did, half delighted to see familiar faces, half ritual in their kindness. I walked past that back table where hymnals were stacked, heart thumping like a drum in someone else's funeral march. The binder slipped under the other booklets, perfectly unremarkable. I stayed for 10 minutes for appearances, sang twice to steady my voice, pretended this was about something larger and loftier. Then I left. The first shock came in the form of silence that was too loud. My ex-mother-in-law posted the next morning as if the world had tilted. She wrote about alienation, aging, being persecuted. Comments started piling up again. Sympathy, love, assurances. Then screenshots began to appear. Someone had photographed the binder, contents, and uploaded them to the same church group where her post had originally lived. The upload was raw and immediate. An image of the kiss on our couch. Then his name next to the mistress's name. Then lines of text where he admitted everything. That post went viral within a small community faster than any sermon ever had. I watched from the margins, like a person observing a slow-motion car crash who is also responsible for the guardrail. The comments shifted, first shock, then disbelief, then anger, then the kind of righteous fury that can't be easily nominated back into prayer. People who had been lecturing me for weeks began to ask questions out loud, in a way they hadn't before, questions that demanded receipts. The pastor himself stepped in, a calm face I had seen countless times on Sunday mornings, and urged people to keep conversation respectful. I felt a strange, cold satisfaction at that moment. Not gloating, not a grin of triumph, but a quiet, justice-fueled acknowledgement that the truth had arrived in a form that could not be misinterpreted. What surprised me most was how quickly the church turned on the in-laws. Human empathy, when fed real detail, is mercurial. The same people who had nodded at an elderly grandmother's grief began to see the pattern of manipulation in her messages. Suddenly, the letters my daughters had received handed in heavy envelopes with pitying notes were scrutinized. When the church leadership read the emails where the in-laws had admitted that the affair existed and openly ridiculed my daughters, there were consequences that were immediate and relentless. There were whispers of accountability, requests that the couple step back, invitations to counseling offered by the very same pastors who had once embraced them. For people who live in a moral economy, exposure is devastating. The in-laws' reaction was to splinter. They stumbled between denial and rage. The mother posted a grief-laced, hurt-filled message about feeling abandoned and unloved. The father, stooped and embittered, made small gestures of defiance, visiting certain members of the congregation, speaking in sharp tones about the unfairness of being judged. But the community recoil was effective. Invitations dried up. Calls stopped. The man who used to be a fixture at Sunday coffees found himself alone. The mother began to talk about loneliness in very loud, very public ways, as if to petition the internet for mercy. People responded with pained, cautious messages, some apologetic, some angry, most bewildered. Meanwhile, my daughters were being watched by all of this like birds at a window. At first, they were hesitant to trust that this reversal could last. 15-year-olds, who have been told they are cruel, 2 days earlier tend to be slow believing when complimented. But then they began to receive letters, apologies, short and honest, from people who had joined the pile-on against them. One woman showed up at our door, awkward, wearing her guilt like a scarf, and handed the girls a card with trembling hands. She said, "We should have asked first." My eldest read that card on the porch and looked at me like a child, discovering that the weather had changed without warning. There were tears, yes, but they were not the empty kind. They were something like relief, but more fragile. Relief that someone could be convinced by truth, and that the truth had been given voice. In the weeks after, life rearranged itself. The in-laws stopped attending the church. I heard secondhand that the mother had posted about being ostracized, how the church had abandoned her in her time of need. I tried not to laugh. There was no joy in it, only the dry chuckle of someone who'd watched the scales fall flat on the side of fairness. They retreated into a kind of private fury that was visible if you knew where to look. Curt emails, terse phone calls, legal threats that never materialized beyond a single lawyer's letter.
They threatened to make the custody fight public, to drag my daughters through court. But those threats dissolved quickly when their social capital evaporated. In the end, people who have no allies have less power than people who have law on their side. The in-laws had burned bridges that a courtroom couldn't rebuild. Emotionally, the payoff for me wasn't a parade or a dramatic confrontation. There was no cinematic moment where they stood in the pulpit and wept while I took the stage. Instead, the victory was quieter. An email from a school counselor saying my daughters were sleeping better. A neighbor who hadn't spoken to us since the funeral, who now waved across the street. 2 notes folded into the mailbox at odd hours. "I'm sorry," written in someone else's shaky hand. Those small things reopened a possibility of normalcy, and for my children, normalcy meant a chance to unwind the knots of betrayal threaded through their teenage years. But the story isn't purely satisfactory, and it would be dishonest to present it as such. Revenge has a moral gravity all its own. I had exposed private things, and in doing so I had demolished certain illusions. That was necessary. I don't regret it. But the collateral damaged strangers' discomfort, reputations ruined. the very real loneliness of two elderly people who had made monstrous choices was not something I waved away. At night, I would sometimes lie awake feeling flush with vindication and cold with sorrow in the same breath. Justice satisfied part of me and wounded another. There are some kinds of sympathy that are human and some that are poisonous. I wrestled with where I drew the line. I decided the line was at my daughter's safety and dignity. Everything else, I told myself, had to fall where it may. Months later, when the dust settled into a kind of domestic calm, I had a moment I hadn't expected. My youngest came home from school and dropped her bag on the kitchen counter. She was smiling in that rare, private way kids do when their armor is cracking. She hugged me without stiffening, and for once it felt unburdened. Not a brief comfort before more blows, but something steady. "Mom," she said, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I slept straight through. Last night, for the first time since Dad's funeral, it was such a simple thing that I had to sit down. I realized then that everything I had done wasn't just about humiliation or revenge. It was about making room for them to heal. Sometimes the only way to protect someone is to ensure their abusers cannot continue to weaponize social structures against them. That was the moral calculus I had to live with. People still ask questions, friends, nosy neighbors, church members who had watched it all unfold. "Do you regret it?" they would ask. The truth is complicated. I would not go back and undo what I did because my girls' nights are less haunted now. They laugh at things they hadn't in years.
But I also carry the knowledge that I became an agent of exposure, and that exposure, while necessary, leaves scars. There are evenings when I think about the in-laws, lonely and cut off, and I feel a prick of sorrow. Then I think about the messages they sent, about calling my daughters bastards, and blaming them for telling the truth that saved them in courtrooms of their own making, and the prick fades. In the end, the story that began with a market confrontation and a social media post ended as a quiet reweaving of ordinary life. My daughters joined a new therapy group that helped them talk through grief, not just the grief of losing a parent, but the compounded grief of having their grief weaponized. I stopped worrying that there would be another ambush at a stall or another sermon that listed us as sinners in need of correction. The church, which once had seemed like a united front against us, became a place of mixed faces, some who would always judge, some who had learned to listen, and some who showed up with casseroles and regret in equal measure. If I have learned anything from this entire ordeal, it is that truth is an inconvenient but indestructible force. People will try to shape it, to dress it in narratives that suit their comfort. But when you place clear facts, photos, texts, emails, into the hands of people who can see and feel and reason, you sometimes set in motion a quiet kind of justice that hums louder than any sermon. My revenge was not about cruelty. It was about protection. It was about ensuring my daughters had the space to mourn a father who had betrayed them and to grow into adults who could trust that their mother would not let vengeance or manipulation stand unchallenged. So when someone asks whether my actions were ruthless, I answer this way: maybe they were. But sometimes ruthlessness is a form of careful mercy. It was the mercy of telling the truth loudly enough that the people who were thriving on lies could no longer do so without consequence. And for my daughters, who now sleep and grow and plan for futures that don't have grief. As a default setting, that mercy was worth the cost.